David Altig, the Executive Vice President and Chief Economic Advisor, thank you, of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta, will now share his thoughts on how the Southeast United States must prepare for climate migration shifts.
Well, thanks for hanging in there, the Hardy group. And thanks to Bob and David for bringing me here. You're probably wondering why a Federal Reserve person is here talking to you. Isn't it my job to make you mad about interest rates and inflation? And we're not trying to make you mad, but yeah, that's usually my job. And issues of climate and weather indirectly, of course, affect our monetary policy responsibilities. Perfect example is trying to figure out how to interpret the labor report from October in light of the effects of Hurricane Milton. But it's really not kind of at the core of anything that we really spend any time on. But there are other responsibilities of the Federal Reserve that do bring climate and weather issues on directly. So one of them is we supervise banks. And of course, one of the things we have to do when we supervise banks is actually think about the risk profiles of the portfolios of banks, which often have property, for example, that are directly exposed to elevated risk associated with all of the stuff we're talking about. The second place it comes in is in our community and economic development responsibilities, where we are charged with thinking about issues as they relate to vulnerable populations, economic mobility and resilience of particularly of low and moderate income populations. So those are the perspectives from which I'm going to speak, this notion of risk and vulnerability of some of our communities as we attempt to deal with the risk. I'm going to talk about migration as a topic, but I'm going to start with talking about in-migration rather than out-migration and sort of circle back. Bob mentioned both of these definitions. And I'm going to try to be expeditious because you must be hungry. You've certainly been patient. So, I mean, here's basically the maps of why this is a particular concern to me from the Atlanta Fed, or those of us at the Atlanta Fed. The left-hand side is immigration or migration flows of the population. The right-hand map is risk associated with natural hazards. So dark blue means lots of in-migration into an area. On the left-hand map, dark red means lots of risk associated with natural hazards. And as you can see, Bob was sort of alluding to this, the US population is not fleeing from disaster, it's fleeing to disaster. Almost all of which, if you get out of California, you're thinking about wildfires and heat and all that sort of stuff, almost all of it is on the Gulf Coast and in the Southeast. And if you're wondering who we represent at the Atlanta Fed, it's all that red stuff outside of Texas. We leave that to Dallas, but we got all the rest of it. So this is sort of the challenge here, is that as the risks elevate, the population exposed to that risk has been elevating at the same time. And here you can sort of see it. These are population trends. I believe this is from the University of Florida. For Florida versus the United States, currently, the population growth of Florida is about quadruple the population growth of the United States. Natural sort of decline in births and decline in deaths as well mean that population is sort of shrinking across the United States, but the relative amount of population growth in Florida versus the United States is not expected to change. I don't know if this year will kind of change that in some way, but there's nothing in anybody's past behavior that suggests it's going to. So I think if we think about kind of migration away from hazards, it's more likely to be of the sort that Bob was talking about, local migration, kind of away from the riskiest places. And that's going to have some implications for this issue of vulnerability of certain populations that I'm going to talk about. So if you want a county by county breakdown, there it is. Sarasota is going to end up being the winner in population growth according to these projections by the time we get out 30 years or so. I don't know what's happening in Miami-Dade. They must be full up or something. I don't know. So I want to talk about this idea of measuring resilience of a community, and I'm going to sort of build it up starting with this notion of the social vulnerability index. As it says there, social vulnerability, which is just hard for me to say for some reason, refers to the demographic and socioeconomic factors that adversely affect communities when they're exposed to hazards or various sorts of community-level stressors. It comes from the CDC, in part. There's a list. I imagine these slides are going to be available, so if you wanted to see what the list is, but it's what you would guess. Poverty, housing affordability, transportation, access, and all those sorts of things enter into this index. And so there's the map of Florida that describes the level of vulnerability across all the various counties in the state. And what I want to just sort of point out about this is almost half of the counties in Florida fall into either the high vulnerability category or the medium-high vulnerability category. And it's not all coastal at all, but a lot of it is, particularly on the East Coast of Florida, up in the Panhandle. But for example, one of the most vulnerable is Orange County. So Orlando falls into that category. Well, that's just this sense of whether or not we have non-resilient, typically poor, typically poorly housed, typically communities that have a lack of resources that make them economically resilient. There's the list of the counties. I won't go through those, but you could see them. The next step then is to combine the two maps that I showed you. So the first map was exposure to hazard risk. That second map was social vulnerability to those risks. And so what FEMA has is really, you can look up any county in the United States. So these are all different counties of putting the two things together. Putting together the risk of damage, the risk of a natural hazard with social vulnerability and the degree of resilience of the communities in which social vulnerability and risk is high. So I'll talk a little bit more about that resilience measure in just a minute. All right, so what do you say? Blue is good. Red is bad. This is like, I went to graduate school, so that's what I learned. Red is bad. I told that to my mom, and she said, I spent all that money for that? I said, yeah, you did. I hope you're proud. So you can, where is it red? Or where is it yellow? It is here. Again, you have quite a bit out in California, basically out in the west there. But that's not where the population is moving. The population is moving here. So again, there's just sort of this warning that Bob was giving us that the United States population is fleeing to risk, fleeing to problems. And so how are we going to manage that and how are we going to think about it is the major question. So I'm going to hone in on Florida a little bit more specifically. So this is the same map. This is the same risk index, only I've just drawn out Florida so you can see it a little better. The one deep red place is Hillsborough. It's here, pretty much. You don't have to go very far. And Sarasota is the high-risk territory too, as is most of South Florida, Central and South Florida, as a matter of fact, and then up into the Panhandle. Florida is ground zero for disaster risk, factoring in both the socioeconomic makeup of the state as well as the probability of something happening, as well as our degree of resilience to manage those things. All right, that's ugly. So let me go even a little bit closer to home here, Sarasota County. So it turns out that the most affordable zip code in Sarasota County is 34287, Northport. And I know that because I got a Google AI response to my search, so it absolutely has to be true. It's also the second fastest growing city in the United States. So again, you know, we have, and of course the second fact is related to the first fact. Great place to come. That's the most affordable part of the area. And so people come. I mean, it's pretty simple economics. But that creates an issue. So here's Northport. Exposure over the next 30 years to 3 problems: flooding, heat, and wind. Dark colors are bad. I mean, it's not necessarily red here, but they couldn't do everyone in red, I guess. They wanted to distinguish between the different kinds of hazards. But if you look at risk from heat, risk from wind, 100% of the properties in the city have an extreme risk. So those dark colors mean extreme risk. A little bit less on flooding, but one of the things I meant to do, I forgot, was go back and see how this outfit, which is an entity that kind of calculates these things, exactly, First Street. I wanted to see what Asheville was for flooding. I bet you it wasn't extreme, and yet we know. So let's think about the resilience piece of this then. I mean, we can sort of see what's happening. We're at ground zero for lots of problems. So how would we want to manage it? We would want to manage it by all the things that you heard about. Here's a list that was basically Dr. Monroe's list, right, of things that we do to ensure and promote resilience of the local community, particularly in terms of its physical infrastructure and housing. Can it be done? Yeah, of course it can be done. There are examples of it being done not very far from here. Probably even in this community, but this is an example of Babcock Ranch, which basically did all of the stuff that was on that list. By the way, that list was like the CDC list, but it was from the Urban Institute. And so, you know, you harden up the power grid, bury wires, you make building codes so that they're hurricane resilient. You kind of stay away from floodwaters and have good water management. You have lots of green space to deal with the heat issues. All right, great. And I think if I remember this correctly, it withstood its first big test quite nicely. And all of them, yeah, and it had a couple more after that. I guess Ida was the first one, yeah. Yeah, they're a little bit further south, so they might have lucked out a little bit there, but here's the deal. It was basically open space where they could build, and it was built for rich people. Let's kind of face it. We have to ask, is this scalable? Is this replicable? One of my favorite economists is a guy named John List at the University of Chicago. He wrote a book called The Voltage Effect. I encourage anyone who is thinking about solutions to social problems and community problems, and doing that through pilot projects and sort of demonstration projects, to go read The Voltage Effect, because The Voltage Effect is all about how you get it wrong by not kind of thinking about the appropriate checklist when you try to take an idea, you prove it locally, and then you try to expand it. And it turns out to be not robust to all the different circumstances that you're going to face in other places. And Babcock Ranch might be one of those instances. I want to point out in that regard that zip code 34234 in Sarasota County has the highest poverty rate in the county. It's about double the national poverty level. Look, it's, to come and talk about vulnerable populations in Sarasota is not all that easy in some sense. Y'all rich folks. I mean, it's, relatively speaking, the poverty rate is very, very low in the county. It's like half of the national average. But there are pockets like this zip code, and it has exactly the same risk profile as Northport. Everything is the same, except this is a socially vulnerable community. And of course, affordable, being the most affordable community or city in Sarasota County doesn't mean affordable in the usual sense. So this is, what do I have here? There's not a scale there. Yeah, oh, so it is Sarasota. So this compares Sarasota. I wanted to make sure it wasn't Florida. This compares affordability in Sarasota versus the United States. And by the way, high is bad on this particular one. It's the share of median income relative to housing expenditure. So you already have an affordability problem. People moving into the most affordable place, but in general, affordability is a problem. There is a poverty issue. And so I want to now go back to this kind of thinking about building a resilient community in the sense of being able to withstand natural hazards and disasters and weather and climate issues and all that. And the approaches that are sort of in those pillars of development are about regulation in some sense. It's basically largely in many ways a zoning thing. Lots of green space. Make sure people don't build in certain places. Invoke building codes that are robust to weather. But here's a thing we know, and this is an economist graph, but I want to, so from bottom to top, that measures, is giving you some notion of how affordable housing is. So as at the very lowest part, that means your housing is not affordable at all. From left to right, it's measuring how much regulation is imposed in the local area. These are metro areas. So as you go from left to right, you're getting more regulation. As you go from top to bottom, you're getting less affordable. So what you see is this is about as tight a correlation as you can find. Regulation is systematically, almost everywhere and always, associated with less affordability of housing. So the solution, so again, remember my frame here. My frame is I'm thinking about the combination of risk, resilience, and vulnerability of certain populations. So here's a chart that says the solution is also part of the problem, potentially, if we don't do it right. Now, I'm making no judgment about whether this was good regulation. That's a different sort of question, but it's also the one that we need to enjoin, is what is the impact of these regulatory approaches to dealing with natural disasters on the larger community. So I'm going to sum up here, and so I got through this pretty quickly, as I intended. Here's the challenge. First of all, if I'm here, assume population growth. I mean, it's going to happen. This is a nice place. It's got low taxes. This is a place to be. Now, some people will get scared away, and we heard a lot about that. But, you know, the last 10 years didn't scare anybody away. And the last 10 years, as Bob's chart showed, you know, demonstrated plenty of risk. Now, some of that maybe it can be managed by moving to less risky areas, but I want to point out something. I want to point out that often when people move, say, to higher ground, further away from the water so that you mitigate some of the flooding risk, you're moving into the places where people of lesser means already live, and they live there because they can't afford to live closer where you live. And as you move out, you're moving them out too. We see it time and time again. This is the huge development problem. The huge development problem is we displace people and have no plan to deal with it. So, second bullet point, plan to absorb the growth with intentionality towards sustainability and resilience. That's, of course, important. But the final bullet point is the one I really sort of want to emphasize here, because you've heard a lot about those first two things. Lots of good ideas, and there are lots of good ideas. But I think sometimes that last bullet point is forgotten. Every development effort has to actively engage the most vulnerable parts of the community. If you have a planning board, if you have a development council, if you as a nonprofit are attempting to find solutions to all these problems, if you don't have not just listening to the vulnerable communities, but actually bringing them on into the process, we're just going to have a different set of problems to deal with. So let me stop there, having proselytized as much as I had to.